Hi guys, today we are going to discuss about the remaining terminology for your performance of your computer and also going to derive the basic performance equation. In last video we have been discussed about the response time. Okay, the first terminology of your performance. So that is your first parameter. We have been discussed about the response time. So we will discuss here a remaining terminology. So under that your first terminology will be CPU time, or we'll call it as CPU execution time. So what is the CPU time or execution time? The CPU time is the time between the start and the end of your execution of the given program. That is, this is the time in which the processor is going to be active. Okay, in response time now, it is the time required to complete the given task, and that time will going to include all your CPU activities, IO activity, memory activity. That is called as response time. CPU time now, it is a time in which the processors will be active. That is, it does not include any IO activity or some other program. So when the processors get active, the start time to the end of the execution time will called as CPU time or execution time. Next parameter is the clock cycle, or we'll call it as clock period. So clock cycle is the amount of time between the two pulses of oscillator. So this is your that is one positive and negative it covers, will called as clock cycle. Next, clock rate, or we'll call it as clock frequency. So the inverse of your clock cycle or clock period will called as clock rate or clock frequency. And the CPU time, it is given by the equation, that is your CPU execution time for the program will be equal to CPU clock cycle for the given program into clock cycle time. That is, it is the product of CPU clock cycle and your clock cycle time. So next we'll see the last parameter, which is called as CPI, clock cycle per instruction, CPI. What is this CPI? So this CPI is going to tell you the average number of clock cycle for each instruction takes to execute is called as CPI. Okay, the average number of the clock cycle for it is taken for the each instruction to execute is called as CPI. It is given by the equation instruction of the number of instruction for the program into average clock cycle per instruction. So we can rewrite this equation, where we can write this instruction for the program as n. We can represent as n. And this average clock cycle we can represent as CPI, clock cycle per instruction. We are going to rewrite this instruction as CPU clock cycle will be equal to n. This n going to represent a number of instruction for the program into average clock cycle per instruction. We are going to represent as n into CPI. So this is the important equation. So this equation will be used while deriving your basic performance equation. Now we will derive, and also this can be written as CP will be equal to, from this equation calculate what is your CPI. CPI will be equal to CPU clock cycle divided by n. So now we will derive your basic performance equation. So for this basic performance equation, we need your CPU execution time. So the formula for CPU execution time is CPU clock cycle into your clock cycle time. Okay, so let it be your first equation. As we know, what is your clock cycle time? So your clock cycle time will called as inverse of your clock rate. Okay, so time will be inversely proportional to frequency. Okay, time will be inversely proportional to a frequency, will called as clock rate. So now substitute 2 in 1. Substitute 2 in 1. After substituting 2 in 1, will get us CPU clock cycle divided by clock rate. And we know what is your CPI. So what is the CPI formula? We know your CPI will be equal to CPU clock cycle divided by n. So where we'll call as n as number of instruction, and now from this calculate what is your CPU clock cycle. So from this equation calculate what is your CPU clock cycle. So CPU clock cycle will be equal to, cross multiply this CPI into n, substitute 4 and 3. Substitute 4 and 3. After substituting, we'll get us CPU time will be equal to CPI into n. N is called as number of instruction divided by clock rate. Let this equation, let it be 5. Let it be 5. And this equation we can rewrite also. We know 1 by frequency. 1 by frequency will called as 1 by clock rate will called as what? Will called as time. So we can rewrite this equation as CPI into n into clock cycle time. We can rewrite this equation in this manner also. So this is the final equation for the basic performance of a computer. This is the important formula. Thank you.